Good afternoon. Wow, what a crowd. My name is Henry Brady. I'm Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you today our featured speaker, Joseph Stiglitz, university professor and winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. He's taught at Princeton, Stanford, MIT, Oxford, and now Columbia. At Columbia, he founded and is co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue and is a member and former chair of the Committee of Global Thought. Professor Stiglitz currently serves as the president of the International Economic Association, and he served as chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank from 1997 to 2000, and before that he was a member and chair of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Clinton administration. His work, of course, is exceptionally highly regarded both in technical economics and in just more broad commentary on the economic scene in America. He also has one distinguishing and important feature. He was born in Gary, Indiana, along with Michael Jackson. So shares the same hometown. Also, I think Paul Samuelson was from Gary, Indiana. So Gary, Indiana, of course, by the way, is an example of part of what's happened to America, the loss to manufacturing jobs as U.S. Steel has lost its jobs, and I think closed almost all the plants, if not all of them, in Gary, Indiana. Professor Stiglitz has written a series of books that have had enormous impacts on global debates, especially more recently on inequality. His latest book is The Great Divide, Unequal Societies and What to Do About Them. It was just published this month and is being sold here today, courtesy of Mrs. Dalloway's bookstore. Professor Stiglitz will be signing books after the talk. So let's welcome Professor Joseph Stiglitz. And here discussing the Great Divide with Professor Stiglitz is our very own UC Berkeley, Robert Reich, Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy. Professor Reich, yeah, look at He served as Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration. He's written numerous books, including The Work of Nations and Supercapitalism. He also released a film in 2013, Inequality for All, which is available on Netflix, iTunes, and DVD. His latest book is Beyond Outrage, What Has Gone Wrong with Our Economy and Our Democracy and How to Fix Them. Let's welcome, you've already done this, but let's do it again. Let's welcome Robert Reich.
Thank you, Henry. Let me thank Henry Brady, Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy. The Goldman School of Public Policy that is my home, Annette Dornbus, who helped arrange this. And Joe, let me thank you. You're on a book tour. A book tour is a grinding, awful thing for anybody, I know. But something that Henry did not mention, you just told me last week you were trending. Now, I don't know what trending means, but I think Joe Stiglitz deserves to be always trending. But Joe, thank you again. We're here to talk about your book, but we're here also to talk about the larger question of inequality, particularly in the United States. And one question for you is, why do you think that the United States is such an outlier? That is, inequality is growing in every advanced country, but why is it particularly extreme in the United States?
You might say it's part of American exceptionalism.
Exceptional. I wish exceptionalism were actually in a positive way rather than a negative way.
But I think the fact that we have more inequality than any of the other advanced countries, I think says something, because the underlying economic forces, globalization, technology, whatever you think of, demographic even, they're playing out similarly in all the other advanced countries. So if it's not these underlying drivers that has led America to be at this extreme, what is it? In my view, it's very much our policies. appropriate to be talking about in a policy school. But it's our policies, which are then related to our politics.
So you have said, just jumping off from that, that inequality in the United States has been a matter of choice. We have chosen inequality, and just to
not the poor people. You want me to make it clear?
Not everybody has chosen inequality.
Not everybody chose.
Well, that's
but
who is it who has made the choice of inequality?
Well, it's part of our political process, and let me try to just articulate one more aspect of when I say it's our policies. You know, markets don't exist in a vacuum, and they structure our economic relations, whether you have monopoly power that drives up prices and therefore drives down real wages, or you don't have unions, so you have weak unions, that drives down, you know, bargaining power of workers, where you have globalization structured where it's easier for jobs to go offshore and then the goods to come back. All these affect the distribution of income, they affect the degree of inequality. So then you have to ask the question, what is driving the political process? And both you and I know a lot of, we work together in the Clinton administration a lot, and it has to do with the role of money in politics.
So going back to the Clinton administration, did you see any money in politics in the Clinton administration?
Yes, there were some very sensitive moments maybe I can share. One of the things that...
Oh, not that one.
One of the really most tense moments during the Clinton administration, I don't know if you remember this, is that we had begun... There were budgetary problems at the beginning of the administration, like there are always, and we began to think about how we could put our country in a better budgetary stand and yet make the economy stronger. And one idea that Bob and I and a few other people came up with is there were a lot of what are called tax expenditures that are spending for things hidden in the tax code. Spending things like for subsidizing corporate jets, subsidizing fossil fuels. And I don't know if it was your word or anyway, it became fashionable to call
corporate welfare.
Corporate welfare. And Bob Rubin went ballistic when...
I'm appalled.
When we started calling these things corporate welfare.
Actually, I don't know if you remember this, but I gave a speech in which I called these things corporate welfare. If we're moving from welfare to work, which was one of the major themes of the Clinton administration, why don't we get corporations off their welfare and finance a better welfare to work system? And I was called into the Chief of Staff's office with various other members of the White House, and I was told if I ever use that term again, I might not have my job.
Yeah, I remember that.
Do you?
That's why I don't know if I should have brought it up,
Yeah.
but it was an emotional, I mean, it was a very emotional, you saw the forces at play. But let me just...
Oh, but let me make sure that everybody knows. I use that term repeatedly.
Yeah. And I continue to support you, and I still continue to use that term corporate welfare because I think it really captures a lot of what was going on. And one of the things that was on the list of corporate welfare, even from the conservatives, like from the Cato Institute, was the bailouts of the banks. I don't know if you remember that. And we had no inkling of what would be the magnitude of those bailouts 16 years later.
Right.
That was when they were small and limited before they got to the $1 trillion size.
Well, there had already been the S&L, the Savings and Loan bailout.
That's right.
And there had been other smaller bailouts.
Oh, there had been a number of bailouts, but
Yeah.
it was, the magnitude of that
Right.
was obviously dwarfed. But there was an example of how the rules and regulations, the political influence shape the way our economy functions. Very early on in the administration, I don't know if you were there, we had a discussion of the excessive CEO pay and executive pay. And there was a strong concern around the country about this, and we decided to impose effectively a tax on pay in excess of $1 million. And then one member of the economic team, who I won't mention.
Oh, go ahead.
He had just made $25 million a year before, and he thought this was maybe not such a good idea. So he came up with a really good suggestion, good in quotes, that if the pay was called performance pay, it would be exempted from the tax.
If it was linked to corporate performance, that is linked to share prices.
Yeah, and that set off or exacerbated the stock option. I had written before a number of articles pointing out that stock options were a really bad way of incentivizing, because what they encourage firms to do were to do distorted accounting to get their share price up, and that they were actually almost unfair in the following sense. You got rewarded if the Federal Reserve lower interest rates and the stock prices go up. If you were running an airline and the price of gasoline goes down, stock price goes up, did the CEO responsible for that? Obviously not. So what was called incentive pay had nothing to do with incentives of the good kind, and a lot to do with the incentives of the bad kind. And we saw that all the accounting scandals that played out. And then some of us said a little bit later on that, if you are encouraging these stock options, which we were doing through the tax system, then at least the shareholders ought to know what's going on. When you give a stock option, it's not like manna from heaven. They would like to sell it, is that money that went, the stock options, came out of thin air and nobody was paying the price. But I began my career in physics before I got waylaid by concerns about inequality. And one of the things you learn in the first class in physics is the law of conservation of nature, of matter. And so you know that if somebody's getting something, it's coming out of the hide of somebody else. And we ought to have transparency. So the real point was that stock options are a dilution of the ownership claims of everybody else. And so we said, you ought to have disclosure. Well, the same person who was responsible for the clever stock option provision.
Is this the same person that tried to get me fired?
Yes.
For corporate welfare?
That same person said, oh no, that will confuse the market. They won't understand it. Let's keep it in the footnotes. We'll have disclosure, but in footnote 743, and make sure that nobody, and that way it won't confuse people.
Joe, I want to get back to...
Can I make one more point about this?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So when you have these kinds of incentives for stock options, they are part of the reasons that we've gotten this divide at CEO pay, and why the CEO pay relative to workers has gone from 20 to 1 to, on average, 300 to 1, and in many of our corporations, 500 or 1,000 to 1. So, that's one of the manifestations of inequality. And to link it to the main thesis, it's that the way we structure our economy structures our inequality. So we didn't have to have that law, but we chose to.
Well, we also chose, and not only the Clinton administration, but the George Bush, not George W., the first Bush administration, chose to change securities laws in such a way that it was possible to have stock buybacks without telling shareholders exactly when the company was buying back their shares of stock, thereby pumping up share prices just exactly when CEOs were exercising their options with regard to stocks. Now, this is something that is almost never discussed. If this is not insider trading, I don't know what is, but it goes on all the time.
There's one thing that's even worse, and that was...
By the way, this is an upbeat conversation. We want to keep things happy here.
So that they didn't get enough money that way, so they started backdating their you know, there's still a little uncertainty because when you buy back shares, you can't be sure exactly where the stock price is going to go. But if you backdate your stock options, then of course you can choose the dates because you know what the price is. So that gives you a lot more certainty and reduces the risk of stock options.
But somebody listening to our conversation right now might think that the real problem is this person who we're not naming, who is part of the administration, and yet both of us know it goes far beyond an individual
That's why I
person.
didn't want to focus on one person.
Right, and so what's the actual force? What's the mechanism by which big money and in our political system actually affects not only this person, but also a lot of other decisions that this person represents?
Well, there are two mechanisms that I think are particularly important. One is the direct role of money in politics. You know, the last election, each of the two presidential candidates spent over $1 billion. This next election is going to be much more expensive. And they call them campaign contributions, but a better you know, these are not charitable contributions. For the most part, these are better described as investments. And the financial sector made a lot more off of their investments, political investments, than they did out of their financial investments. I mean, those, you know, all the housing securities, those went belly up, but their financial investments paid off a lot.
But Joe, our experience in government was before Citizens United. So everything we saw in terms of those investments are presumably dwarfed by the amount of money in politics now. But let me play devil's advocate, because some political scientists say to me, but given the huge return on those political investments, you'd expect much more money in politics. The actual amount of money in politics may seem very large, but from the standpoint of an individual company or even an individual industry, it's still quite small. How do you explain that?
Well, there are other forces at play. You know, there are examples where, you know, and those some of the things that give me hope occasionally, an upbeat element in this conversation. So, for instance, in the 2014 election, there was a very big attempt to disenfranchise a lot of poor people, African Americans. The whole campaign of, you know, if you couldn't prove Hispanics, you know, if you didn't have a driver's license, you couldn't prove you couldn't vote. And that backfired because a lot of the people who would have been disenfranchised got so angry that they came out to vote. And that was one of the reasons that in certain places we got a lot better outcomes.
You're talking about the midterms just now, 2014, or are you talking about 2012?
I was talking about 2012.
Yeah,
2012.
because the one thing
2012. In 2014, turnout was really low.
Lest we become too joyful in this conversation, let's remember that in 2014, the actual turnout was the lowest we've seen since 1942, when a lot of people couldn't turn out because they were fighting a war. So we do have something of a problem.
And this actually links with one of the themes, that this kind of inequality has led to a kind of undermining our democracy, because when that money gets translated into the political process, people feel disenfranchised.
Why bother?
Why bother? And that's maybe why we don't have that much money they don't need to spend that much money to sort the whole political process.
That's what I thought you were getting at. My sense is that you're not going to spend any more money than you need, and if you can get your way without spending a lot of money, that's right, why spend more? Now, the Koch brothers, I don't want to pick on anybody, and I don't want this to be in any way perceived to be a partisan discussion, but the Koch brothers have already raised something in the order, their network, of about $900 billion for the 2016 election.
900 million.
900 million. Yeah. Did I say billion? 900 million.
They were
goodness
wishing.
It's
That's
not
right.
900 million. $900 million, that is approaching $1 billion. That's more than the Republican National Committee spent in 2012. And are we on the way to having a third party of oligarchs?
I think there's a real concern. And that echoes one other aspect, just to mention, and you bring this out in your movie, that the degree of wealth inequality, we talked about income inequality being exceptional in the United States. Wealth inequality is also exceptional. I mean, there's this one statistic that 2 families with 8 people, the Koch brothers and the Waltons famous for their good labor relations, gender discrimination, and corruption in Mexico. Those 2 families inherited as much wealth as the bottom 44% of America. And that means, of course, that in the electoral process, they have a lot more voice.
Which makes me want to ask you an academic question. You are an economist. You're not a political scientist. Why is it that the economics field, the field of economics, has not paid more attention to inequality and to the dynamics? I mean, there used to be a field called political economy. But we're not hearing that much. A lot of economists have not wanted to get into this. Now, there are notable exceptions. Emmanuel Sayes here has done extraordinary work. Thomas Piketty has done extraordinary work. But in terms of the political aspects of economics, how politics shapes the market, there's not a huge amount of work recently, is there?
No, you're absolutely right. And now, for a long time, there was a general sentiment among economists that was actually summarized most forcefully by Bob Lucas, who got a Nobel Prize, who actually said it was invidious, it was wrong to talk about inequality. And it was the most poisonous thing you could do. Now, there was a theorem behind his statement, and it doesn't sound like a theorem when you use words like that, but there was a theorem. The theorem, for those of you who know economics, is called the second welfare theorem. And it basically said you could separate out efficiency from distribution. That the job of the economist was to make the size of the economic pie as big as possible. The job of the political scientist or the politics was to divide that pie. So you can separate these 2 things out, and economists should focus just on one thing, making the size of the pie bigger. And doing anything else was distracting the profession from its core mission. Now, it turns out that, like any theorem, it depends on the assumptions. One of the key assumptions is perfect information. And some of you may know I spent a lot of my life worrying about the consequences of imperfect and asymmetric information. And when you have imperfect and asymmetric information, the theorem is not true. You can't separate out efficiency from equity. Now, anybody who is immersed in the real world like Bob knows you can't separate out efficiency from equity. So it wasn't maybe for you, a big insight that the theorem that Bob Lucas was using was wrong. But this has been very strong within the economics profession for a very long time. These doctrines are so embedded into the mindset of economists. It's one of the reasons why the economic models that were being used by central banks before the crisis did so poorly. They couldn't see what was going on in terms of inequality. So most of those macroeconomic models they use a representative agent model. A representative agent model says everybody's the same. Of course, they didn't believe everybody's the same, but what they really were saying is the differences aren't important. You could describe the economy very well as if everybody were the same. And you see that mindset still evident. There was a big fight, some of you may know, about who should be the chair of the Federal Reserve. And one of my students won that battle, Janet Yellen. And she gave a speech.
She's also on this faculty,
Oh, that's right.
Not now, she was. on
No,
this
I
panel,
understand, yeah. She gave a speech not that long ago where she said, she started talking about inequality. And she was taken to task by some Republicans. I think they were afraid that she was going to try to reduce inequality. They wanted to increase inequality. So there was a little difference of view about what you should do. But the view was that the chairman of the Fed should not talk about inequality. One of the points I make in these essays in The Great Divide is actually Fed policy has a lot to do with inequality. It's one of the things. I mean, I talked about the rules, we talked about the tax policy. It's actually also the way the Federal Reserve conducts monetary policy has had a big effect on inequality.
Well, there are two different views about that. I'd love to have your take. One view is that if the Fed keeps interest rates very low, and that generates more, a tighter labor market, more economic activity. A tighter labor market means that people at the bottom get higher wages. But there's a contrary view, and that is by keeping interest rates very, very low, the Fed is putting more and more money into the stock market. And the owners of the stock market are overwhelmingly wealthy, and they have been doing wonderfully well as a result of this Fed policy. What side do you come down on?
I'm a two-handed economist, and so I'll say both.
Good.
So let me say, the right answer to our economic dilemma, you might say, is we should be using fiscal policy.
Right.
We're trying to do too much with monetary policy. And, we can borrow at -2% in real terms. We have investments that yield in technology, education, infrastructure, a whole host of investments that yield huge returns compared to that -2%. And that would therefore improve the balance sheet of the country, make the country a stronger, and not only a more equal society, but a stronger economy. But to come back to our refrain, our politics is making that difficult, not possible. In fact, going the other way, we've actually contracted the size of the public sector since 2008. So that means the only game in town is monetary policy. And what is absolutely right is that probably the first order effect of monetary policy, of a lack of stimulation, is higher unemployment. Higher unemployment hurts workers three ways.
Lack of stimulation mean higher interest rates would create lack of unemployment.
More unemployment,
and that
lower wages,
hurts workers.
And because the economy would be weaker, lower tax revenues, and so that would lead to more cutbacks.
So as a first order, low
interest rates are good for equality. Now, my criticism goes a little bit beyond that and say, look, but to get the real benefits from low interest rates, from loose monetary policy, you have to make sure the credit channel is working. And they haven't done a very good job on that. Lending to small and medium-sized enterprises years after the crisis began, the recession began, remember in December 2007, years later, small and medium-sized lending is much lower than it was before the crisis. And in the United States, SME lending is a very big source of job creation. And when the Fed and the administration went in to save the banking system, they were interested in saving the big speculative banks, not into the local, regional, community banks that are much more involved in lending to small businesses. When we bailed out the banks, we didn't put any conditions on, the president said, we're giving you this money. Why are we doing it? He was very explicit. It's not because we love the banks, although I think that was really the true agenda. But we're giving it so that to keep the blood of the economic system, money flowing, to get money into business so they would lend. Now, at the World Bank, when we lent money, we said if we lent money for building a dam or for doing a particular thing, we made sure the money went where we said it was going to go. And we call that conditionality. Sometimes we put too many conditions, but we said, this is why we're giving you the money, and you can't go take a vacation with that money. But when we gave the money to the banks, we didn't put any conditions on. So some of the money went out to pay bonuses for what? I couldn't figure that out.
Well, it was for top executives.
Top executives.
For nothing.
Yeah, exactly. So we didn't say you have to lend. So the result was lending went down.
So is this another case of political influence causing economic policy to be skewed toward inequality?
Very much so, very much so. We decided on trickle-down economics in the bailout. Throw money at the banks and pray that it would help the economy.
And and so you had two administrations involved. You had
That's right.
the previous George W. Bush administration, and you had the Obama administration. And even in the Obama
But they were
administration,
same people.
They were the same people.
Bernanke, Geithner, the team, there was only one person who changed on the team, so it was 2 out of 3. So it wasn't a big change.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to come back to the second part of your question, though. So what we should have done, first fiscal policy, if we couldn't get fiscal policy, lower interest rate, but make sure the credit channel was working, the banking system was competitive, the benefit of the lower interest rates went out to where it was supposed to do. We didn't do that, so the Fed failed.
Right.
What it did do is another instance of trickle-down economics. It was another instance of if we can get the wealthy enough, they will spend more, and that will reinvigorate the economy. But what they forgot was that when you lower the interest rate, those elderly people who have been more prudent and not very well off, have put their life savings into government bonds. And the interest on government bonds went down to close to 0. So their consumption had to go down. So we encouraged the consumption of the very rich. We really discouraged the consumption of the elderly who were poor. Investment didn't get very much stimulated. And so net, it was probably slightly positive for the overall economy, but net, it also increased inequality.
But you've just given a statement of kind of economic policy that failed. You could view what you just said as an example of inadvertent bad consequences, or you could, as you said about 3 minutes ago, view it as exactly what policymakers thought would happen because the political forces operating on those policymakers actually anticipated exactly what happened. In other words, the policy discussion we very often have, you and I have, many other people have, we look at policies that are made and say, oh, well, that was just, it shouldn't have been that way. The public was sold a bill of goods, but maybe it was just a bad outcome. But then there's another set of lenses that we can use and say, this is really almost all about politics. People know exactly on the inside what they're doing and why they're doing it. They just don't want to share it with the public because they don't want the public to know.
Well, as I said, I think it's a little bit more complicated.
That's pretty complicated as it is.
No. But, so for instance, when, go back to 2008, 2009, when the crisis was beginning and the economy was crashing, I think there were 2 things that were going on. The people who were at the table and influencing the policy really were people from the financial market for the most part. And so both presidents, were hearing the world as seen through the eyes of these particular people. And for the most part, they actually believed that they understood that they were going to be the direct beneficiaries, but they actually believed, just like Charlie Wilson did. I don't know if you remember the famous thing, what's good for General Motors is good for the United
Charlie
States.
Wilson, yep.
And this is another example. The bankers really believed that the necessary and sufficient condition, necessary and sufficient for saving the U.S. economy was giving the bankers as much money as they asked without conditions.
So they believed in trickle-down economics.
They really did believe in trickle-down economics. And I remember, a phone call I was on with the Democrats. The Lehman Brothers had just collapsed. The question was, how do we respond? And so Obama, who was a candidate at the time, was trying to, we wanted to be cooperative, and what should our position be? And they were, as you can imagine, almost all people from the financial community. And there were just so many memorable moments in that conversation. One of them was several of the bankers said, "Why do you want to limit it to $700 billion? We might need more than that." And the tone was, "Don't worry about that. If you need more, you'll get more. We just don't want to. We don't want to upset Congress. $700 billion seems like a lot of money to a lot of people." And I said, well, if you're going to use this approach, and I don't think I was impolite enough to say trickle-down economics, but I try to say, really at the root of our problem has been this housing crisis. Again, I didn't want to insult all these bankers and say, because you engaged in predatory lending, you were just getting your comings.
Joe,
but
I have a
diplomatic.
parenthetical. Why didn't you want to insult them?
Oh. Well, I was trying to get the conversation to where I wanted it to go, is the answer. So sometimes you might be more successful. I don't know. So I said, you got to deal with the homeowners. You got to make sure that, that we're going to be we are facing massive foreclosures. Really, if you want to save the economy, you really ought to be doing something about the foreclosure crisis. And, there are lots of things that you could do. I've talked about something called a homeowners Chapter 11. I won't go into the details. And almost to a person, the general sentiment was, oh no, go away. We don't want to talk about that. We want to focus on really the important issue of saving the banks. And at the end of the conversation, what was interesting, Obama had picked up on my remarks and made a little speech about that. But then he talked to Geithner and some other people. Nothing happened. And then as time went on, I got called into the Treasury. Again, try to explain about home ownership. And then you started getting arguments, and you began to see a little bit more clearly how people's mindset is so shaped by the people that they talk to. So,
in fact, my experience was exactly the same, Joe, that once the problem is defined in a certain way, and once a president and the key people around him agree that that is the definition of the problem, the game is over. You can't really get into that game because everybody has invested a certain amount of intellectual capital and then political capital in that framework. But
can I just say one thing, because this is about inequality and fairness. It is interesting how the vocabulary of inequality and fairness enters into arguments on all sides. So I remember in another meeting I had at Treasury where I again was urging doing something about homeowners. And the Secretary of Treasury said something to the effect, it would be unfair to the homeowners who didn't have a mortgage or would pay back the mortgage to help out those who were being foreclosed against. And then I said, well, but what about the help that we've given to all the bankers who brought the country to the brink of ruin? What about that equity in the rest of America? And that was just outside of their frame. They could see one kind of inequity, and they debated it, and they had said, we can't do anything about the homeowners because of that division. didn't bother them any of the other inequities. And they would use other words, just, like moral hazard. They'd say, oh, this will create moral hazard. And I say, moral hazard? We've been talking about banker moral hazard for years. And, I don't think most homeowners are going to borrow money in order to lose their home. That's not what we're talking about here. But the bankers have done it over and over again. And we talked about it in the East Asia crisis. We talked about it then. And we have real evidence of moral hazard. Just slid by as if nothing had happened.
So, Joe, just to review, we've talked about how politics, raw politics, influences policymaking. We've talked about how a lot of people who take frames of analysis that actually enrich themselves, but they actually believe in it because they have a self-interest in believing it, how that affects public policy. What about not only macro, but let me give you an example of current micro, and particularly where economics says one thing, traditional economics, but you and I and others worried about inequality might come to a different conclusion, and that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, the administration is pushing, as we sit here today, very hard on Democrats in Congress to go along with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Republicans, most of them, not all, are going along with it. Most economists, based on kind of Ricardian ideas that go back a very long way, say trade is good. What's the argument that if you were sitting today in the Obama White House, you would provide?
Yeah, it'll be very clear after a few minutes. I think these trade agreements are really bad. And these new trade agreements. And I think the issue of the Trade Promotion Authority, which is called Fast Track, is particularly bad because it's basically giving not only Obama a blank check, but the next president, who we don't know, a blank check. And it's a very big blank check. Because I think almost never does an agreement that gets reached get rejected.
Well, even if the next president actually has a blank check, she is going to take that blank check and do with it whatever. I mean, that
Exactly.
is, if the Obama administration is very much pushing the Trans-Pacific Agreement, then the next president will presumably do the same thing with the next
Hopefully
agreement.
not. She won't.
So what, from a standpoint of economic analysis, you're head of head of the Council of Economic Advisors. You are sitting there in the White House. This issue comes up, and what do you say?
Okay, so I first begin by pointing out something that Paul Krugman has emphasized. This agreement is not about trade. Actually, I have an essay in this book about that. These new trade agreements are not, one of the things those of you in the policy schools know that whenever you have a bill, you should name the bill the opposite of what it is. So if you have a bill that's about managed trade, you call it a free trade bill. So this is not about free trade. It's not even about trade. So the most invidious part of the agreement is a set of provisions which are designed to undermine the ability to regulate the environment, health, every aspect of our society. When we were in the administration, we had a very big fight over a concept called regulatory takings. The concept of regulatory takings is that when you pass a regulation, you were restraining somebody from doing something they shouldn't do. And usually they want to do that, corporations want to do it because they make more profits. So restraining them from doing it lowers their profits. And the corporations say, well, if you pass a law restraining us from poisoning you or doing other things, you should compensate us for not killing you. And that's called a regulatory taking. And believe it or not, Obama is taking that view.
Well, a similar provision was in NAFTA.
Yeah, and we never really understood that. We were both in the administration at the time. It was never discussed.
It was never discussed.
No, and I actually asked the USTR at the time, Mickey Cantor, afterwards, did he know?
Well, somebody must have known. You were head of the Council of Economic Advisors. I was Secretary of Labor. We were both at these tables where NAFTA was being discussed, and the president was there. And why did nobody raise this, and who put it in?
Well, it was put in the Bush administration, and we inherited.
Oh, we inherited.
We inherited the bill, and no one sought to renegotiate it. There were negotiations on the environmental and labor sidebars, as they were called, but nobody looked at the text. And everybody's busy. You know, I'm not a lawyer. You are a lawyer, but you know, if you want to get put to sleep, try to read these trade agreements, and they're written really so that only other trade lawyers can make money out of interpreting them. So they are a way of supporting the trade legal profession. But now we know. Now we know about these provisions. And let me give you, you know, they spread around the world in lots of agreements. There's one provision that has gotten, in one example, but it's typical of the examples, and I think it shows how bad things are. Many of you may know about 19th century, there was a trade imbalance between China and the West. China had lots of things that the West wanted, including porcelain. And the West had nothing that China wanted, and there was a big trade imbalance. And those you know about macroeconomics, trade balances are not very good. And then the West figured out a way of correcting the trade imbalance. A product that we in the business school at Columbia, and all business schools say has really good properties. One of the things when you have a good product, what you want is what are called repeat purchases. And they buy it, they come back. And the product that had this really good characteristic was opium. Because once you bought it, you kept coming back. China figured out that this was not such a good product for China. And they banned it. And the West said, this is a basic right that we have to send products that kill you. You know, these are human rights that we're talking about now. And they went to war with our support. And there were actually not one war, but two wars, opium wars, and that's how the West got the concessions on the east coast of China. Your government, the US, is now waging the new opium war. Now, it's not about opium, but it doesn't take long to figure out where I'm going on this, I hope. A product that has this characteristic of repeat purchases and kills is cigarettes. And governments, you know, around the world, and encouraged by the WHO, have passed regulations, mild regulations, not forbidding it, but just discouraging people. Labeling, this may be hazardous to your health. Now, in Uruguay and Australia, they took this one step further, and they have pictures of a kind of lungs that you'll look like after you smoke. And it's not a very pretty picture. And guess what? It actually works. People are discouraged from smoking. Philip Morris is very upset because they say this is taking away our profits because people aren't buying the cigarettes. And Uruguay and Australia say, yes, that's exactly what we intended. Because we think health is important. We have to pay for the health costs. We have to pay for, you know, if you get TB, if you come down with lung cancer, the costs often are faced by the public. In the US, we sued over these health care costs. So the Philip Morris is suing Uruguay and Australia for trying to just label cigarettes
under trade agreements that are very similar,
essentially identical,
yeah,
to the TPP and the transatlantic.
And they have this provision that allows companies, global companies, to sue
in
national
private
governments,
courts, in private courts,
in tribunals that are outside the legal system of any country.
And when you think about it, one of the basic functions of government, of the public, is a judicial system. Transparent, precedents, appeal, all these provisions of a judicial system that we built up over hundreds of years to protect us. And they are trying to undermine that, but it's not an accident, because they want to undermine it so the outcomes are pro-corporation. one of the most important aspects of inequality, and I talk about again in the book, is equal access to justice. We say justice for all. And what we've really evolved to is a system where we ought to be saying in the Pledge of Allegiance, not justice for all, but justice for all who can afford it. And that's what this is about. These private courts are very expensive. So Uruguay is a poor country. It can't afford to defend itself. So fortunately, some rich Americans, Mayor Bloomberg, Bill Gates, are actually paying for Uruguay's expenses because they happen to believe in health. Obama doesn't seem to. And the real irony of this is the signature signature achievement of Obama has been Obamacare, health care. One of the intentions was to lower health care costs. But another provision will have the effect of raising the cost of pharmaceuticals because we have a delicate balance between generics and big pharma. And it was called the Hatch-Waxman Act. It was done in the 80s, so that today in the United States, 87% of all drugs are generics. It's a balance in the sense that that competition from generics keep the big pharma prices from being even higher than they otherwise would be. So it's pulled down our cost. The trade agreement is unbalancing this balance. It's giving more power to big pharma. You asked, we beat up a little bit on the finance sector. Big pharma is another person at the table. The generics are not at the table.
But you say big pharma is a person, but corporations are not people. Or maybe they are. The Supreme Court says they
Sorry,
are. I do have just one other question for you directly, Joe. We've talked so far about inordinate political power expressed in a variety of ways. How does this end? What's the future? Can you say something that is uplifting and positive?
So let me say, okay, I'll first begin with something that's uplifting, and then just so you aren't left on that high, I'll try to bring it back down to earth.
Thank you.
So the uplifting is that there have been moments in our history where we have the kind of inequality that we have today. The end of the 19th century, the Gilded Age, the Roaring '20s, where the top 1% got essentially the same amount that it's getting before the 2008 crisis. And in both of those instances, we pulled back from the brake. We had the Gilded Age was followed by the Progressive Era, bipartisan. It was Teddy Roosevelt who passed antitrust laws and that tried to protect the environment. So that was one example. The Roaring '20s was followed by this social, the Wagner Act, the Social Security, the social legislation of the '30s, the golden age of capitalism in the '50s, '60s, where the country grew together. So in both of these instances, we reversed what seemed to be, at the moment, an irreversible trend. So the hopeful note is that we'll do that once again. Now, there are other reasons for this hope. The fact that this debate about inequality has finally reached the top of the agenda. Even Republicans are talking about it. It wasn't that way 4 years ago. 4 years ago, Mitt Romney would almost be proud about the fact that he was paying only 14% of his income in taxes and keeping his money in the Cayman Islands.
Well, Hillary Clinton begins her campaign 2 weeks ago saying that the deck is stacked in favor of those at the top. I don't remember a president beginning a political campaign with anything close to that.
So, and Mitt Romney said you should only talk about inequality behind closed doors and quiet voices. We've come a long way in those 4 years. I think your movie helped, and I think lots of these things helped. And secondly, there is a bigger grassroots movement, and I think political action is really important in this arena. We're seeing the success of that. but it shows you I don't want to say the dilemma we're in. 70% of Americans believe we ought to increase the minimum wage. The economic evidence that an increase in the minimum wage would not have any significant adverse effect, maybe even a positive, is overwhelming. David Card here has done some of the best research in that area.
And Michael Reich as well.
Yeah, exactly, that's right. So we have a lot of evidence. Today we're different. When we debated the question 20 years ago, then a lot of the people who were on the minimum wage were teenagers and after job in school. Now, disproportionately, it's families who are supporting a whole supporting a whole family on what amounts to $15,000 a year. That's not possible. So, in spite of the fact that 70% of Americans or more support this, we can't get it through Congress. Can you believe that? Yeah, you can't believe it.
I can believe it.
But the good news is that in cities all around the country, I just was in Seattle, they're actually taking action at the local level. Mayor de Blasio in New York on Wednesday announced a commitment to reduce the number of people in poverty by 800,000. And that a key part of that was raising the minimum wage, but also housing and environmental policies, a whole set of policies. So it's beginning. So that's the hopeful note.
Joe Stiglitz, I want to thank you again for joining us. It's been a great trip.